Early Christianity was completely decentralized. It consisted of related local assemblies which were founded and served by different itinerant apostles. These were traveling religious leaders that would stay for a year or a couple of months in one place and then move on to found a new church, a new assembly in a different place. This early Christianity in the first 2 centuries is now called Catholic or Proto-Catholic Christianity. It's the mainstream sort that was represented by the writings that made it into the New Testament. But that was not the only interpretation of Jesus in the marketplace. There arose a large number of challengers. Most of them are now referred to by the poorly defined term Gnostic. This word comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. And one thing Gnostics had in common is they believed that there were certain more spiritual people who had a kind of mystical insight that other people lacked. And there was often a secret message that could only be taught to these special, more spiritual people. Each so-called Gnostic group was formed around a teacher, and it wasn't really an organized or unified movement. One can see this sort of challenge even in the letters that made it into the New Testament, several of which are meant to combat the false teachings of various, usually unnamed people. One common theme in Gnostic versions of Christianity was Docetism, that is, Docetic Christology. The idea here is that Christ only appeared to be a human, that because he is divine, he is therefore not human. This comes from a Greek word that means to appear or to seem. The idea is that Jesus seemed to be a real human being, but in fact was not. They assume that the divine can't be corrupted by matter, nor can the divine change or suffer. If Christ was divine, then he must not have really had a body. He must not really have changed or really have suffered. He must have only appeared to do so. Even the 4 Gospels in the New Testament seem to oppose this idea when they clearly assert that Jesus was a real human and that even after his resurrection, Jesus had a physical human body. These Gnostic movements were simply preaching a different message than mainstream Christianity was. And in response, the mainstream began to do certain things. First, they began to formulate their own canon lists, their own lists of approved writings. This was to exclude various Gnostic writings and just any sort of pseudepigraphal writing, any sort of writing that wasn't really written by who it said it was written by. And as the 2nd century went on, they began to insist that local assemblies, local churches, should be controlled by one bishop. A bishop was a single religious ruler who ruled over all the churches in a city. People then were not allowed to baptize or to teach without the approval of this bishop. A bishop is sort of like an apostle, except that a bishop is attached to one place. Also, by the late 100s, the mainstream people began to argue that true Christian churches had a history of leaders that could be traced right back to the apostles. This is called the theory of apostolic succession. They even claim that the apostles had explicitly transferred their authority to the bishops. Another idea that developed was that bishops of big and religiously important cities should be given more authority. Thus, by the 6th century, there was a clearly defined pentarchy of patriarchates. A patriarchate is a city that's ruled over by a patriarch. That's just a bishop in one of these important big cities. And the 5 were Rome, important as the capital of the empire, and then the capital of the western half of the empire, and also the place where Peter and Paul were martyred. Constantinople. This was the new capital built by Constantine and modestly named after himself in the 300s. It became the ruling city of the eastern half of the empire when it was divided. Alexandria, long important as a center of learning and trade. Antioch, an important center of early Christianity. And Jerusalem. This map also shows most of the early expansion of Christianity up to the year 800. It leaves out a few footholds in India and possibly China. And there were Christians a little bit farther south in Africa, in what was called Nubia, now Sudan. And you can notice a pattern here that Christianity first spread to the big cities. It spread through trade, through soldiers, through the kind of long-distance travel that the Roman Empire made possible. And then it kind of moved out from there until it covered larger territories outside the cities. But back to the bishops. Here's the bishop that surely you've heard of, the Pope. The bishops of Rome had, especially since the late 100s, been very influential in mainstream Christianity. And as time went on, they began to claim a special status. Leo I argued that quote, "Because St. Peter was the first among the apostles, St. Peter's church should be accorded primacy among the churches," end quote. In the New Testament, Peter is a leading apostle. He's in Jesus' inner circle. He sometimes speaks for the apostles. He's kind of the most faithful and boldest and bravest among them. And Jesus says he will build his church on the rock of Peter. In Roman Catholicism, he's considered to be the first pope. Historians would say that's an anachronism because there weren't bishops back then. There wasn't a system of single bishop rule in the first century. In any case, he was an early leader, and he was seemingly killed in Rome, which we'll talk about later. The word pope is from the Latin word papa, meaning father, and this was in ancient times how they generally addressed bishops, as father, as someone with a parental authority over them. This claim of the Bishop of Rome was never accepted in Eastern Christianity, although for a time they used to ambiguously honor the Bishop of Rome as, quote, "a primary among equals," end quote. In our next segment, the changing social status of Christians in the Roman Empire.